The air was sharp that evening, carrying the chill of winter and a quiet tension that seemed to wrap itself around the neighborhood like a suffocating blanket. Detective Jordan Hayes pulled into the corner lot, his car humming softly before falling silent. It had been a grueling 12-hour shift, the kind that drained not just energy, but the will to do anything except go home. As he stepped out, the worn soles of his shoes met the cold pavement, and he tugged the hood of his red sweatshirt over his head, trying to keep warm. Across the street, the faint glow of a neon sign flickered above a small corner store. Jordan's stomach rumbled faintly, but he ignored it. All he wanted was to grab a bottle of water and something light, head back to his car, and retreat into the solace of his home. He didn't know it yet, but his life was about to veer into a nightmare he hadn't asked for. Not far away, Officer Kyle Brennan sat slouched in his patrol car. His eyes scanned the streets with a practiced but weary gaze. The crackle of his radio punctuated the silence, reporting a nearby robbery, a suspect vaguely described as a black male in dark clothing. Brennan chewed on a toothpick, his mind snapping to attention when his gaze landed on Jordan. To him, it was almost too perfect. A black man in a hoodie walking into a store. The adrenaline surged through Brennan, clouding his better judgment with a toxic mix of suspicion and implicit bias. He didn't see a tired man grabbing some essentials after a long day. He saw a suspect. Jordan walked into the store, nodding politely at the cashier as he reached for a bottle of water and a pack of gum. He paid, not thinking twice about the exchange, and stepped back out into the night. But the moment he hit the sidewalk, something shifted. He felt it, a prickling awareness that the air had grown heavier, the streets quieter, almost like they were holding their breath. A shadow lingered in the corner of his eye, a car crawling too slowly along the curb. Then, like a hammer cracking the silence, red and blue lights exploded behind him. "Stop right there, hands where I can see them." The command was sharp, almost slicing through the cold air. Jordan froze, his pulse quickening as he turned to face the officer stepping out of the patrol car. It was Brennan, his hand hovering over the holster of his weapon, eyes locked on Jordan like he was prey. Jordan raised his hands slowly, the weight of disbelief settling in his chest. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice measured but tinged with frustration. He hadn't done anything wrong. He knew that, but he also knew how quickly things could spiral if he didn't keep his composure. "You matched the description of a robbery suspect," Brennan barked, stepping closer. His tone wasn't just authoritative, it carried an edge, the kind that made it clear he wasn't open to negotiation. Jordan's breath caught for a moment. He'd heard these words before, seen this scene play out too many times in news stories and viral videos. But this time, it was happening to him. Jordan's badge was tucked safely inside his jacket, a small shield of authority that had often felt like armor in moments like these. But as he reached for it slowly, he couldn't shake the sinking feeling that tonight, it might not be enough. "I'm Detective Jordan Hayes," he said, his voice calm but firm. He held up his badge, the silver glint catching the light from Brennan's patrol car. "I'm off duty. There's been a mistake." But Brennan didn't even blink. His hand stayed on his weapon, his posture rigid with suspicion. "You don't look like a cop," he said, his words cutting like ice. Jordan's jaw tightened. It wasn't the first time someone had questioned his authority, his presence, his right to simply exist in spaces like this. But it stung just the same. The streets around them began to stir as people noticed the flashing lights and the unfolding confrontation. A few stopped, pulling out their phones to record. Jordan could hear their murmurs, a mix of confusion, concern, and anger. The weight of their eyes pressed on him, but his focus stayed on Brennan. He had to de-escalate this, had to find a way to get through the wall of bias and fear that had turned a fellow officer into an adversary. "Look," Jordan said, keeping his hands raised, his voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air. "I'm not armed. I'm not your suspect. Let's handle this like professionals." But Brennan wasn't listening. The crowd's presence seemed to agitate him further, his grip tightening on his holster as he barked. On the ground. Now, the sharp command sent a ripple of gasps through the onlookers. Phones rose higher, their lenses capturing every word, every motion. Jordan stayed rooted, his hands still raised. "I'm not going to the ground," he said firmly but without aggression. "I'm a cop, just like you. Check my badge again. Call my precinct if you have to. But lower your weapon. This doesn't have to escalate." The crowd grew louder, voices rising in protest. "He didn't do anything," someone shouted. Another voice chimed in. "What's wrong with you, man? He's showing you his badge." But Brennan's eyes flicked between Jordan and the growing crowd, his expression a volatile mix of insecurity and defiance. The situation was spiraling, the weight of it pressing harder with each passing second. Jordan's heart raced, but his years of training kept him grounded. He could feel the tension in the air, taut like a wire about to snap. The sound of distant sirens broke through the noise, growing louder as backup approached. Jordan knew this wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. It was something bigger, something that would ripple far beyond this block, this moment. The flashing lights, the raised voices, the cameras capturing every detail. It all pointed to a storm brewing on the horizon. And as the squad cars pulled up, spilling more officers onto the scene, Jordan could only hope that cooler heads would prevail before the night took a turn no one could come back from. The squad cars screeched to a halt, their lights casting a harsh, pulsating glow on the tense scene. Officers spilled out, hands hovering over holsters as they assessed the situation. Jordan stayed rooted in place, his hands still raised, his pulse drumming in his ears. He could feel the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes watching, some behind the windows of nearby apartments, others from the phones of the growing crowd. Every breath felt heavier, every second stretched longer. A female officer stepped forward, her gaze darting between Jordan and Brennan. Her voice was steady but laced with urgency. "What's going on here, Brennan?" she asked, her tone hinting at more than just professional concern. Brennan gestured sharply toward Jordan. "Robbery suspect," he said, the words clipped. "Matches the description. Non-compliant." Jordan felt the heat rise in his chest. Non-compliant. That word echoed in his head like a bad joke. "I told you, I'm Detective Jordan Hayes," he said again, his voice cutting through the noise but tinged with exhaustion. "Off duty, badge right here. Call it in if you don't believe me." The female officer frowned, taking a step closer to Jordan. She studied him, her eyes narrowing slightly, and then glanced at the badge he held. Something in her posture softened just a bit, but she didn't lower her guard completely. "Brennan, did you check his ID?" she asked. Brennan bristled. "He could have stolen it," he snapped. "People fake being cops all the time." Jordan's patience was wearing thin, but he kept his composure. He'd learned the hard way that losing his temper only gave people like Brennan an excuse to escalate. "Run the number on the badge," Jordan said firmly. "Call the precinct. Do something other than pointing that weapon at me." The female officer's radio crackled to life, cutting through the charged silence. A voice on the other end was giving updates about the robbery, locations, suspects, details that only made this scene feel more absurd. The suspect had been spotted 3 blocks away, fleeing on foot, and wearing a completely different outfit. Jordan clenched his jaw. He wasn't just being mistaken for someone else, he was being willfully ignored. She reached for her radio, her fingers moving in a practiced motion. "Control, this is Officer Monroe," she said. "I need verification on badge number 5829. Detective Jordan Hayes. Over." The wait was agonizing. The crowd murmured louder, frustration bubbling up as they questioned what they were witnessing. One man's voice cut through the noise. "This is why we don't trust them." He muttered loudly enough for everyone to hear. Another voice responded, "They're treating him like he's guilty no matter what." Jordan didn't react. He couldn't. His focus was razor sharp, his gaze locked on Brennan, who still hadn't moved his hand from his holster. Brennan's face was taut, his jaw clenched so tightly that Jordan could almost hear the grind of his teeth. It wasn't just suspicion fueling his behavior. It was something deeper, darker, something that went beyond this moment. The radio crackled again, and Monroe nodded as the voice on the other end confirmed Jordan's credentials. "Copy that," she said before looking back at Brennan. "He's legit. Detective Hayes, Homicide Unit." Brennan hesitated, his hand still hovering near his weapon, his expression unreadable. Monroe stepped closer to him, lowering her voice. "Stand down, Brennan," she said firmly. "This isn't our guy." Brennan's hand finally moved away from his holster, but the tension didn't leave his body. He stared at Jordan, his expression a mix of frustration and something that looked like anger. Not at himself, though, at Jordan, as if Jordan was the one who had done something wrong. The unspoken accusation in his eyes felt heavier than the entire ordeal. Jordan let out a slow breath, lowering his hands as he tucked his badge back into his jacket. His eyes flicked to Monroe, who seemed to be the only one willing to let reason guide her actions. "Thank you," he said quietly, though the gratitude felt hollow. This shouldn't have happened in the first place. Monroe nodded, then turned back to the crowd, raising her hands in a calming gesture. "It's all cleared up, folks. Move along," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. The crowd didn't disperse right away. People lingered, their phones still recording, their faces reflecting a mix of anger and disbelief. Jordan turned back to Brennan, his voice low but steady. "You didn't even try to listen," he said. "You saw me, and you made up your mind before I said a word." Brennan didn't respond. He just stared at Jordan for a long moment before turning on his heel and walking back to his patrol car. The door slammed shut, and the car pulled away, its lights cutting through the night as it disappeared down the street. The tension in Jordan's chest didn't ease. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, their expectations heavy in the air. He gave them a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of their support, before turning back to Monroe. "Thanks for stepping in," he said. Monroe sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice soft. "This shouldn't have happened, but you know how it is." Jordan's lips tightened into a thin line. "Yeah," he said. "I know exactly how it is." He walked back to his car, his movements slow, deliberate. His mind was racing, though, a torrent of thoughts and emotions colliding in a way that left him feeling unsteady. He couldn't shake the memory of Brennan's face, the hostility, the refusal to see him as anything other than a suspect. It wasn't just about this one encounter. It was about all the times he felt the weight of that same judgment, that same bias, even while wearing the badge. As he got into his car, he noticed the crowd was still there, their phones still pointed in his direction. He gave them a small wave, a gesture meant to signal that he was okay, even if he didn't feel it. The car door closed, and the sounds of the street faded into a muffled hum. He sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white. Jordan knew the video would go viral. He knew people would dissect every second of it, turning it into a rallying cry for justice or a point of contention in an endless debate. But as he sat there, staring at the dashboard, he realized that what bothered him most wasn't the thought of strangers analyzing his every move. It was the fact that this moment, this humiliation, would be just another story in a long list of others like it. Jordan sat in his car, staring blankly at the city lights flickering through the windshield. The adrenaline from the encounter had faded, leaving behind a gnawing mix of anger and exhaustion. He could still hear Brennan's voice in his head, cold and dismissive, as if Jordan's words hadn't mattered at all. It wasn't the first time he faced this kind of treatment, but tonight had hit differently. Maybe it was the crowd, the cameras, or the simple fact that it had happened while he was off duty. Stripped of his shield, his authority had meant nothing. He reached for his phone and dialed a familiar number. After a few rings, a warm, steady voice answered. "Jordan, it's late. Everything okay?" It was his partner, Detective Lila Morales. She'd been his closest confidant since they were paired up 2 years ago, and she had an uncanny ability to tell when something was off with him. Jordan hesitated for a moment, unsure of where to start. "Yeah, I'm fine," he said, though his voice betrayed him. "Had a run-in with a patrol cop tonight. It got ugly." Lila's sigh was audible even over the phone. "What happened?" He gave her the condensed version, leaving out the crowd and the cameras. He wasn't ready to unpack that part yet. Lila listened quietly, her silence more telling than any words. When he finished, she let out a slow breath. "Jordan, I'm sorry. I wish I could say I'm surprised, but—" "I know," he interrupted, not wanting to hear what they both already understood. It's just, he didn't even look at me like a person, Leela. Just another black guy in the wrong place at the wrong time. Leela's voice softened. You're not just another anything. You know that, right? You got people who see you for who you are, Jordan. Don't let one racist idiot take that away. Her words were comforting, but they didn't erase the sting of what had happened. Thanks, Leela, he said quietly. I'll see you tomorrow. As he ended the call, Jordan couldn't shake the feeling that tonight's events weren't over. The video would spread. It always did. He'd seen it happen too many times before. And while part of him wanted to lie low and let it blow over, another part of him burned with a need to do something. He didn't know what, but he couldn't just let this slide. The next morning, the precinct was abuzz. Jordan walked in, his usual calm demeanor masking the storm brewing inside him. Leela was already at her desk, scrolling through her phone with a furrowed brow. She looked up when he approached and gave him a look that told him everything he needed to know. It's everywhere, isn't it? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Yep, she said, spinning her phone around to show him a video of last night's incident. The headline read, *off duty detective detained in heated exchange with patrol officer. Crowd captures the shocking moment. *. Jordan watched the video play out, his stomach tightening as he saw himself on the screen. The angle was shaky, but it clearly showed him standing with his hands raised, his voice calm but firm as he tried to explain himself. It also showed Brennan, tense and unyielding, his hand never far from his weapon. The crowd's murmurs grew louder as the scene unfolded, their disbelief echoing Jordan's own frustration. It's bad, Leela said, her voice low. The comments are a lot. People are angry, Jordan, but there's also the usual trolls defending Brennan. Jordan sighed, running a hand over his face. This is the last thing I needed right now. Before Leela could respond, Captain Reynolds stepped out of his office, his expression as unreadable as ever. Hayes, my office, now. Jordan exchanged a glance with Leela before following Reynolds. The captain closed the door behind them, motioning for Jordan to sit. He didn't. I saw the video, Reynolds said, his tone measured. You okay? Jordan nodded. I'm fine, just tired. Reynolds leaned against his desk, arms crossed. Look, this situation is already out of control. The department's getting heat from all sides, community leaders, media, even City Hall. They're demanding answers. And what about Brennan? Jordan asked, unable to keep the edge out of his voice. Is anyone holding him accountable? Reynolds' jaw tightened. An internal investigation is already underway, but you know how these things go, Hayes. It's complicated. Jordan let out a bitter laugh. Complicated, right. Reynolds sighed. I get it. I do. But you need to keep your head down for now. Let Aya handle it. Jordan didn't respond. He knew Reynolds meant well, but the advice felt hollow. Keeping his head down hadn't stopped Brennan from seeing him as a threat last night, and it wouldn't stop it from happening again. As Jordan left the office, his phone buzzed with a notification. He glanced at the screen and saw a message from an unfamiliar number. *, we saw what happened. You're not alone in this. Let's talk. *, the message was signed with the initials JM. Jordan frowned, curiosity piqued. He debated ignoring it, but ultimately decided to respond. *, whoa, is this? *, he typed back. The reply came almost instantly. *, someone who's been where you are. Meet me tonight. I'll send the details. *. Jordan stared at the message, his mind racing. He didn't know what to make of it, but something told him this wasn't a random stranger. Whoever Jam was, they knew more about last night than they were letting on. And Jordan couldn't shake the feeling that this meeting would be the first step in uncovering something much bigger than one bad encounter. Jordan couldn't shake the strange feeling that the message he received earlier was more than a coincidence. As the hours passed, he found himself checking his phone compulsively, waiting for the follow-up details. Leela noticed his unease as they worked through their usual caseload, but she didn't press him. It wasn't like Jordan to seem distracted, but after the events of the previous night, she figured he had good reason. By late afternoon, the message finally arrived. It was an address on the outskirts of the city, along with a time, 9:00 p.m. The cryptic nature of the invitation only heightened Jordan's curiosity. He knew meeting a stranger under these circumstances wasn't the smartest move, but something about the tone of the message, combined with the escalating chaos around him, pushed him to take the risk. As darkness fell, Jordan told himself he was just going to hear the person out. He didn't mention the meeting to Leela or anyone else. This felt personal, like a path he needed to walk alone. The address led him to an old community center that looked like it hadn't been in active use for years. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for a few cars scattered around. Jordan parked near the entrance, his hand instinctively brushing against the holster hidden under his jacket as he stepped out. The air was cold, and the faint hum of distant traffic underscored the eerie quiet. He approached the building cautiously, scanning for anything out of place. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit interior. A figure stood waiting near the far wall, their face obscured by the shadows. "Detective Hayes," the person said, their voice calm but firm. "Thank you for coming." Jordan stopped a few feet away, his hand hovering near his holster. "You got me here. Now who are you, and what do you want?" The figure stepped forward, revealing a man in his late 40s with graying hair and a worn leather jacket. His eyes were sharp and intense, the kind that had seen too much. "My name's James Mercer," he said. "I used to wear the same badge you do, until I couldn't anymore." Jordan's guard didn't drop, but his curiosity deepened. What's that supposed to mean? James gestured toward a nearby table, where a laptop and a stack of files were spread out. "It means I know exactly what you're up against, and I'm here to help you fight it." Jordan frowned, crossing his arms. "Fight what exactly?" James didn't answer right away. Instead, he opened the laptop and hit play on a video file. The screen showed grainy surveillance footage of what appeared to be a routine traffic stop. But as the video progressed, it became clear this wasn't just any stop. The officer involved displayed the same aggressive body language Jordan had experienced the night before, escalating the situation with a young black man who was clearly trying to comply. Jordan felt his stomach tighten as he watched. "This is Brennan," he said, recognizing the patrol officer immediately. James nodded. "It's not the first time he's done this, and it won't be the last unless someone stops him." Jordan looked up from the screen, his mind racing. "How did you get this?" "I've been keeping tabs on guys like Brennan for years," James said. "He's not an outlier, detective. He's part of a pattern, a culture that protects people like him while punishing anyone who speaks out." The words hit Jordan like a gut punch. He'd always known there were problems within the system, but hearing it laid out so plainly was something else entirely. "Why are you showing me this?" he asked. "Because you're in a unique position to do something about it," James replied. "People are paying attention to your story right now. The video from last night, it's not just going viral. It's sparking conversations, protests, demands for change. But if you don't step up, it'll all fade away, and Brennan will walk away clean." Jordan hesitated, his instincts as a detective battling with his emotions as a man who had lived through the kind of injustice James was describing. "You're asking me to go public." "I'm asking you to be the kind of cop you wanted to be when you first put on that badge," James said. "The kind who doesn't just look the other way." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Before Jordan could respond, a loud noise echoed through the building, a metallic clatter, like something being knocked over. Both men turned toward the sound, their hands moving to their weapons in unison. "Did you tell anyone you were coming here?" James asked, his voice low. "No," Jordan replied, scanning the shadows. The tension was palpable as they crept toward the source of the noise. The silence was deafening, each step amplifying the sense of unease. When they reached the back of the room, they found an open window swaying slightly in the breeze. Whoever, or whatever, had been there was already gone. James cursed under his breath. "They know." "Who knows?" Jordan demanded, his patience fraying. James didn't answer right away, his expression dark. "Let's just say Brennan's not the only one who's been protected. There are people who don't want the truth getting out, and they'll do whatever it takes to keep it buried." Jordan felt a cold knot form in his stomach. This was bigger than he'd realized, bigger than Brennan, thicker than one bad night. And if James was right, stepping into the spotlight could mean putting a target on his back. But as he looked at the files spread out on the table, filled with names and stories that mirrored his own, he knew he couldn't turn away. Not now. Jordan stared at the files on the table, their weight feeling heavier than the room itself. Each paper held a story, names, dates, reports of misconduct buried under layers of bureaucracy and silence. He could see himself in those names, each one a reminder of the fragility of justice for people who looked like him. But as the gravity of James' words sank in, a nagging thought crept into his mind. If this information was so damning, why hadn't James acted on it before? Why bring this to me now? Jordan asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. If you've had this evidence for years, what stopped you from going public? James's face hardened, his gaze steady. Because I tried, he said quietly. And it cost me everything, my career, my family, my freedom. The people who protect guys like Brennan don't just cover up, they retaliate. They made sure no one would believe me. But you, he gestured toward Jordan. You got something I never had, public attention. That video is your shield. If you move now, they can't bury this as easily. Before Jordan could respond, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Pulling it out, he saw a text from an unknown number. Asterisk, asterisk, you're in over your head. Walk away before it's too late. Asterisk, asterisk, a chill ran down his spine as he showed the message to James. They're watching me, Jordan said, his voice low. James nodded grimly. They're not just watching. They're waiting for you to slip up. This isn't a game, detective. These people play for keeps. The tension in the room was suffocating, and Jordan's instincts screamed at him to leave. But before he could make a decision, the sound of tires screeching outside shattered the uneasy silence. Both men rushed to the window, their eyes narrowing as they saw two unmarked cars pull into the lot, their headlights off. The doors opened, and several figures stepped out, moving with practiced precision. Looks like we've got company, James muttered, already moving toward the back exit. Jordan followed, adrenaline pumping through his veins. Who are they? James glanced over his shoulder. Let's just say they're not here to talk. The two men slipped out the back door and into the night, sticking to the shadows as they made their way to the edge of the lot. Jordan's car was too exposed, and James was nowhere in sight. Their only option was to keep moving. They ducked into a nearby alley, the distant sound of footsteps growing louder as their pursuers closed in. You've got a plan, right? Jordan hissed, his breath visible in the cold air. Working on it, James replied, his tone clipped. They turned a corner, only to find themselves facing a dead end. James swore under his breath as the sound of footsteps grew impossibly close. Jordan's mind raced, every nerve in his body on high alert. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he spotted a fire escape leading to the roof of a nearby building. Up there, he said, pointing. James didn't hesitate, climbing the rusted ladder with surprising agility. Jordan followed, the metal creaking under their combined weight. As they reached the roof, they crouched low, peering over the edge just in time to see the men below spread out, their movements methodical. Who are they? Jordan asked again, his voice barely above a whisper. James's jaw tightened. Private contractors. Hired muscle for people who don't want their fingerprints on anything. Jordan felt his pulse quicken. He wasn't just dealing with a corrupt cop, or even a broken system. This was something far more organized and dangerous. And if they were willing to send men after him in the middle of the night, he could only imagine what they were capable of. As the men below moved out of sight, Jordan turned to James. What now? James hesitated, then pulled a small flash drive from his jacket pocket. This has everything, he said. Every report, every piece of evidence I've collected. If something happens to me, you need to get this to someone who can use it. Jordan took the drive, the weight of responsibility settling heavily in his palm. Nothing's going to happen to you, he said firmly. We're getting out of this. But even as he said the words, doubt gnawed at the edges of his resolve. They were outnumbered and outmaneuvered, with no clear way out. And as the faint hum of a helicopter grew louder in the distance, Jordan realized the night was far from over. The helicopter's hum grew louder, its searchlight sweeping the area below. Jordan crouched lower, his heart pounding as he clutched the flash drive like a lifeline. James was scanning their surroundings, his mind clearly racing for a way out. The cold night air bit at their skin, but neither of them noticed. Survival was the only thing that mattered now. "We can't stay here," James muttered. "They'll corner us." Jordan's phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number. Asterisk asterisk. "You're out of time. Surrender now, and maybe we'll let you walk away." Asterisk asterisk. "Who are these people?" Jordan demanded, his voice a mix of fear and frustration. "What's their endgame?" James hesitated, his face a mask of conflict. "It's not just Brennan," he admitted. "There's a whole network behind him, politicians, business owners, even high-ranking officials. They profit from the chaos, and anyone who threatens their operation becomes a target." Jordan's stomach churned. He had known corruption ran deep, but this was beyond anything he had imagined. Before he could respond, the sound of boots on metal made them both freeze. Someone was climbing the fire escape. "Move," James whispered urgently, pulling Jordan toward the far edge of the roof. Below them was another building, the gap between the rooftops just wide enough to make a jump dangerous but possible. "You've got to be kidding me," Jordan said, glancing over the edge. "Unless you've got a better idea," James replied, already backing up to get a running start. Before Jordan could argue, James took off, leaping across the gap with surprising grace and landing hard on the other side. Jordan took a deep breath, his mind flashing with every possible way this could go wrong, then ran and jumped. For a terrifying second, he felt weightless, the void below him threatening to pull him down, but he managed to grab the edge of the opposite roof. James reached out, hauling him up just as the first man reached their original rooftop. The helicopter's spotlight swung toward them, and Jordan and James sprinted across the roof, weaving between vents and satellite dishes to stay out of sight. The noise was deafening, the rotor blades slicing through the air like a countdown to their capture. Just as they reached another fire escape leading down to the alley, a shot rang out, striking the metal ladder inches from Jordan's hand. They both ducked, and James pulled a gun from his jacket, returning fire. The rooftop erupted into chaos, the sound of bullets ricocheting off metal and concrete echoing in the night. "Go," James shouted, covering Jordan as he scrambled down the ladder. Jordan hit the ground running, his mind racing. They needed a safe place to regroup, somewhere the men wouldn't find them. But as he turned a corner, a black SUV screeched to a halt in front of him. The doors flew open, and armed men spilled out, surrounding him. "Drop it," one of them barked, his weapon trained on Jordan. Jordan raised his hands, his mind scrambling for a way out. Before he could say anything, James appeared behind the men, his gun leveled. "Let him go," he demanded, his voice cold and steady. The standoff felt like it lasted an eternity. Then, in a blur of movement, James fired, taking out one of the men before diving for cover. Jordan seized the moment of distraction to dart into the shadows, his heart pounding as he ran blindly through the maze of alleys. He didn't stop until he reached an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. Collapsing against the wall, he struggled to catch his breath, his thoughts a whirlwind of fear and determination. He still had the flash drive. As long as he had that, there was hope. The sound of footsteps made him freeze. He turned, his pulse spiking, only to see James limp into the warehouse, clutching his side. He was bleeding, but his expression was defiant. "They're not going to stop," James said, his voice strained. "We have to go public, now." Jordan nodded, pulling out his phone. He uploaded the contents of the flash drive to multiple cloud servers and sent it to trusted contacts, including journalists and lawyers. It was a risky move, but there was no other choice. They had to expose the truth, no matter the cost. As the files began uploading, James leaned against the wall, his breathing labored. "You've got guts, detective," he said, managing a faint smile. "Don't let them take that from you." Before Jordan could respond, his phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number. Asterisk asterisk nice try. But you're too late. Asterisk asterisk. Jordan's blood ran cold as the lights in the warehouse flickered. The unmistakable sound of approaching vehicles filled the air, and he realized they had been tracked. He turned to James, who gave him a grim nod. "This is it," James said. "Make it count." The doors burst open, and a flood of armed men poured in, their weapons trained on the two of them. Jordan stood his ground, his hands raised in defiance. The files were out there now, the truth exposed. Whatever happened next, he knew they had already struck a blow against the corruption. But as one of the men stepped forward, his face partially obscured by the shadows, Jordan's breath caught in his throat. It was someone he recognized, someone he never would have suspected to be part of this conspiracy. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, leaving him reeling as the scene faded to black.